Unit 3. Listening Skills. Exercise 2.
So, Andrew, have you heard about the lecture on Friday?
No, I didn't know we had one on Friday.
It's a special one. One of the PhD students was telling me about it. The speaker is Sheila McKee, you know, the author of that book we've been reading. Well, she's giving a special lecture on global warming. Look, here's a poster. Global Warming, Separating Fact from Fiction. It's being organised by one of the professors in the School of Environmental Sciences, but anyone is welcome to go along.
That sounds quite interesting. Are you going?
Yes, I found her book fascinating, so I hope it'll be good. It starts at 2:30. Do you want to meet beforehand and grab a coffee?
Well, I've got a tutorial until 1:30, but I could meet you after that, say 1:45 in the refectory.
But the talk is in Lecture Theatre C. That's miles away. Why don't we meet on the ground floor of the science block? Then we can go to that little coffee bar near the physics lab.
Then we'll be near the lecture theatre. OK, I'll see you there.
Unit 3. Listening Skills. Exercise 5.
So, what did you think of the lecture?
She's such a good speaker. I'm so glad I went. What amazed me was how controversial some of her ideas were. She really did try to challenge some of our widely accepted beliefs about the subject. But she was such a powerful speaker that I found myself going along with almost everything she said.
I don't think everyone agreed with her, though. Did you hear Professor Lambert at the end?
Well, I think he had a point. Some of the things Mrs. McKee was saying about sea levels, well, she couldn't back it up. She had absolutely no statistical evidence to support it. Professor Lambert was just trying to get his opinion across.
Yes, I know. The question and answer session at the end was the most entertaining part. So many people got involved, and I don't think she managed to answer all the questions.
Did you know she contributes regularly to Scientists Today, and she has her own website? Now that I've read her book and heard her speak, I'm really keen to find out more. I'm definitely going to keep an eye on her blog. It should be worth reading.
Unit 3. Listening Skills. Exercise 8.
That lecture last week on global warming really got me thinking. I've decided I'm going to do my assessed presentation on global warming.
Well, there's certainly enough information on it. How are you going to narrow it down? You can't talk about the whole subject in 15 minutes.
Yes, I know. I've started doing a bit of background reading, and it's fascinating, really. I always thought global warming was a relatively recent thing. So much of the information is about events like the Kyoto Protocol. But apparently, scientists were talking about it nearly 200 years ago.
Really?
Yes. I read that Jean-Baptiste Fourier made a prediction in 1827 about the Earth getting warmer due to an atmospheric effect, which he likened to a greenhouse. So he is in fact credited with coining the term the greenhouse effect.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought it would have been later. So scientists back then were aware that there might be a problem?
Well, yes and no. You see, there were a few who, like Fourier, proposed that there could be a potential problem with global warming, but at this stage no one really knew that the process had already begun.
So when did they begin to realise?
Well, most people didn't really take the whole thing seriously until temperatures started to show a significant rise in the latter part of the 20th century.
Surely temperatures started to rise before then?
Yes, of course. Throughout the earlier part of that century, average temperatures were in fact rising, but only very gradually. And of course, some scientists were monitoring the situation. They rose by 0.25 degrees Celsius during that period.
That doesn't sound much.
Well, I know it doesn't sound a huge amount, but the trend was definitely upwards for 40 or so years. It didn't last, though, and from about 1945 onwards, a lot of scientists lost any interest they might have had in global warming, as the world's temperature showed a downward trend for the next few years.
Why was that?
Well, most scientists reckon it was due to emissions of aerosol sulfates from industrial and volcanic activity, which can have a cooling effect on the atmosphere.
So scientists didn't really sit up and take notice until much later?
That's right. And it wasn't until 1979 that there was enough concern for the World Climate Conference to call on governments to take action to prevent further climate change through human activity. Another thing I didn't know was that greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide weren't recognised as playing a part until 1985.
As late as that?
Yes, I was surprised too. Way back at the end of the previous century, scientists suggested that carbon dioxide and the burning of fossil fuels could affect global temperatures, and this was generally accepted throughout the 20th century. But it was 100 years later that they discovered that actually there were other gases apart from CO2 contributing to the greenhouse effect.
So a lot was happening around that time.
Yes, the 80s was a record-breaking decade for temperature highs. When you compare the temperatures of the coldest years in the 80s to the warmest years 100 years earlier, the 1980s was still warmer. Towards the end of the decade, the USA and Canada suffered a severe drought, which killed thousands and cost around $100 billion in damage. This, as well as other extreme weather events, was presented as evidence of global warming. It was only then that the world at large really became aware of what a huge issue global warming is.
Unit 3. Pronunciation. Exercise 2.
Exaggerate. Exaggeration. Pollute. Pollution. Justify. Justification. Consume. Consumption. Contribute. Contribution. Destroy. Destruction. Deteriorate. Deterioration. Emit. Emission. Contaminate. Contamination. Classify. Classification. Protect. Protection. Inform. Information. Conserve. Conservation. Present. Presentation. Realize. Realization. Populate. Population. Prevent. Prevention. Migrate. Migration. Reduce. Reduction. Recommend. Recommendation.
Unit 3. Exam Listening. Section 3. You will hear a student and her tutor discussing her proposal for a presentation. Listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 25.
Right, Mel. You wanted to see me to get some feedback on your proposal and outline for your presentation. I've had a good look through now and I've made a few notes about areas I feel you can improve. I must admit, when I first saw the topic you had chosen, I was a little worried.
Really?
Yes, well, it can be difficult to produce something fresh and interesting when you take on a topic like climate change. So much has already been written about it and, well, it's not exactly original. But I have to say, I like the way you've approached the subject matter.
Thank you. Yes, I know it's a subject that has probably been chosen many times before, and that's why I decided to take a slightly different angle. I decided to base the presentation on an analysis of extreme weather and natural disasters over the last few years. There seems to be plenty of information on the topic, and I'll be able to include lots of visual material, photographs, graphs and so on.
Yes, I really like the idea, and you've produced a clear outline of the main points. Something I am a little concerned about, though, is the order you plan to use them in. I'm not sure it's entirely logical. I think that needs some rethinking.
Yes, I did wonder about that. Do you think the section on natural disasters should come later?
Yes, but that's not the only thing. Look, I've made some notes and suggested a possible order.
Yes, I see what you mean. I did wonder whether I needed to add a section about the recent flooding in parts of Europe.
Well, I think you should definitely mention it, but I'm not sure it needs its own section. What about including it in the introduction? In my opinion, the introduction is the weakest part. It needs much more substance.
Yes, I wasn't sure what to include.
Well, you need to grab your audience's attention at the start. And then you should include some background information on the topic and outline your main points.
And what's the best way of getting their attention?
Well, it could be a surprising or interesting fact, a picture or an anecdote.
Oh, I know. I found some fantastic pictures on the internet of the flooding. If I can find some statistics about it too, would that be a good way to start?
Absolutely. It will show the audience the relevance of your presentation and bring it right up to date. Remember to check the copyright and acknowledge your sources for any visual material you use.
Really? For pictures? I didn't realise I had to.
Yes, you should acknowledge all your sources in your bibliography and on your slides too.
Well, I've already started my bibliography.
Yes, I looked at that.
Is there a problem?
Not exactly. It's good to see you're taking a note of your sources, but there's so many of them, and I'm not sure about the validity of some of these internet sources.
How do you mean?
Well, take this graph you found about rainfall.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't you find a more reliable source? This is taken from someone's blog. You need to make sure all your information is from trusted sources, academic papers, scientific journals, that sort of thing.
OK. And I need to cut the number of entries in my bibliography?
Only include the sources you actually use and refer to in your presentation. I would say no more than about 10 for this assignment.
Unit 3, Exam Listening. Now answer questions 26 to 30.
OK, so you're happy with the organisation and content. Plenty to work on there. Now, I believe you had some questions about the actual delivery of the presentation.
Yes. Well, it's more the technical side of things, really. I'm not very confident with the equipment, and I've never given a presentation before, so I'm really nervous.
Well, I think the best way to overcome your nerves is by preparing really thoroughly. Make sure you know the subject matter inside out, and that any visual aids and equipment are ready.
Yes, I wanted to ask about that. I'm getting a friend to help me put together the slides. Have you any advice about that?
The one thing I would say is don't put too much information on your slides, just the main points and any relevant visuals. You want your slides to support what you're saying. And I would also keep the slides themselves very simple, no fancy colours or animation that will distract the audience from what you're saying.
No sound effects then?
No, definitely not. And what you need to do is practice. You'll feel far more confident if you've run through it a few times with a friend.
My friend is going to listen to me run through it.
On the actual day of the presentation, there are a few important things to remember. First, think about where you stand. It's vital that you position yourself centrally and make eye contact with your whole audience. Don't forget the people sitting at the sides. If you smile and look friendly, it will make your audience feel relaxed too. And don't fidget and move around too much. It can be very distracting.
What about my slideshow? I'll need to be near the computer to move the slides forward.
Have you thought about using a wireless mouse or keyboard? That will really help. It means you can control the slideshow without having to move or turn your back on the audience every time you change slides.
That's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that.
The other thing to remember is that when we're nervous, we tend to speak more quickly. So make a real effort to speak calmly and clearly so that your audience understands you and doesn't feel rushed.
What about memorising the talk? A friend told me she did that for her presentation, but I don't think she did terribly well.
No, it's not a very good idea. It will make you sound unnatural. And don't read from a prepared speech because that will also affect the delivery and stop you making eye contact. Why don't you try using cue cards? You can include all the main points and any key facts or numbers as a memory aid. It will sound far more natural.
The other thing I'm a little worried about is questions from the audience. Should I answer them immediately or wait till the end?
The best thing to do is tell the audience in the introduction that you will answer their questions at the end of the presentation. That way, you won't get any distracting interruptions. If you're not sure about the answer, ask the questioner to repeat the question. That will give you thinking time. You could always direct the question back to the questioner or the audience, asking them what they think.
Great. Oh, thanks for all your advice. It's been really helpful.
No problem. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Unit 4. Listening Skills. Exercise 2. Today's lecture is the first in a series of lectures about minority languages. We are going to look at a number of languages from across the globe, but today I'm going to start closer to home with a look at some of the Celtic languages, which are mainly, but not exclusively, spoken in northwestern Europe. As you can see from the shaded areas of this map, apart from the clearly defined areas of Scotland, Ireland and Wales, where we have speakers of Scots Gaelic, Irish and Welsh respectively, there are further pockets of other minority Celtic languages in other parts of Europe. First, we have Cornish in the southwestern tip of England, Breton in the Brittany region in the northwest of France, and Manx, a language spoken exclusively by people in the Isle of Man, an island located in the Irish Sea off the northwest coast of England. It is these last three languages that my talk will focus on today. The current number of native speakers is difficult to estimate, but it's clear that Breton has somewhere in the region of 200,000, which is far more than both Cornish and Manx put together. Compare this to the tiny number of Cornish native speakers, 600 or so according to some estimates. These numbers are difficult to verify, but what we do know is that there are significantly more non-native speakers of all three languages, with Breton having as many as 300,000 able to speak or write it to some level. Cornish also has far more non-native speakers, around 3,000. That's 5 times as many as those who speak it as their first language. It is encouraging to see larger numbers of non-native speakers like this, but as you can see, numbers are still very small and a matter of concern. It's a similar story with Manx, with around 2,000 speaking it as a second language, a far healthier figure than the number of native speakers, which could be as few as 100. Unit 4. Listening Skills. Exercise 4. So let's take a closer look at these three languages. All three have declined to different extents over the centuries for various social, geographical and political reasons, which we'll cover in more detail in the next lecture. What I'd like to discuss briefly now are the attempts to revive all three of these languages from, in the case of Cornish and Manx, almost complete extinction. At its peak, Cornish had about 39,000 speakers. That was way back in the 13th century. And by the mid-16th century, the language was in rapid decline. It was still used in some Western communities until the late 1700s, and there are records of it having been used in some Cornish families as late as the 19th century. The revival process started in the early 20th century, with Cornish literature being published and music and even film being revived. A very tiny minority of Cornish children are currently being brought up bilingual, and the language is taught in some schools. It was officially recognised as a UK minority language in 2002, and this led to some standardisation of the various written forms, which had caused a number of disputes since the revival began. In 2010, Cornish speakers welcomed the reclassification of their language by UNESCO from an extinct language to a revitalised but critically endangered one. Manx holds a similar UNESCO status. It suffered a steep decline during the 1800s in favour of English, which was regarded with much greater prestige, and by the 1920s only a tiny percentage of islanders claimed to speak it. It was finally considered extinct in 1974, when its last native speaker died. Since then, there has been a revival on the Isle of Man, which has been helped by the amount of written and audio material available. Manx is now taught as a second language in all the island schools, and there are now a number of children who can be classed as native speakers. The island has also seen increased signage, and Radio Manx broadcasts a number of programmes in the traditional language. Since 1985, it has held official language status in the Isle of Man, alongside English. Breton, meanwhile, suffered a similar severe decline in the second half of the 20th century, and by the first decade of the 21st century, numbers of native speakers had reduced to around a fifth of the 1 million speakers there were in 1950, and most of these were over the age of 60. In recent years, though, the number of children attending Breton language schools, where children receive all instruction in Breton up to the age of 7, has increased. Breton also has a number of publications and many translations, including the comic series Asterix. Despite quite a strong and growing body of literature and media, and a comparatively large number of speakers, Breton is not recognised as an official language in France. This is due to an article in the French Constitution, which states that only French can be officially recognised. Despite the efforts of autonomists and organisations like the Breton Language Agency, which was set up in 1999 to promote the language, Breton remains a vulnerable language and is officially classified by UNESCO as severely endangered. Now let's move on to look at some of the features of each language. If you look at the grammar in each of Unit 4, Speaking Skills. Exercise 4.
I'd like to talk about a letter I received last year. It was a formal letter offering me a job, so it was actually from my current boss. I had been to an interview a few weeks before for a job at an advertising agency. I really wanted the job, and I liked the company because, although it was quite small, everyone was really friendly and the job sounded just what I was looking for. I suppose it had been about 2 or 3 weeks since I had the interview, and because I didn't think I had done well in the interview, I didn't think I had got the job. In fact, I remember I admitted to my family that I hadn't got it, and I started applying for other similar jobs. So when I received the letter and realised who it was from, I immediately thought that it was a rejection letter. I almost didn't carry on reading it. It wasn't until I started reading it properly that I realised that they were actually offering me the job. I was so surprised that I had to read it again just to make sure I hadn't made a mistake. The letter itself was quite short. What I mean to say is it didn't say much except to offer me the job, and I think there were some details about the start date and pay. I think it also invited me to go and meet everyone in the office and to sort out my contract. What I remember most is being so excited as it was my first job offer. And as I said before, I really hadn't expected it, so it was a nice surprise because most of the letters I receive are bills and other boring letters like that. I started the job a few weeks later and I still work there now. It was definitely an important letter for me.
Unit 4, Pronunciation. Exercise 1. A.
I'd like to talk about a letter I received last year.
B.
I had been to an interview a few weeks before.
C.
I remember I admitted to my family that I hadn't got it.
D.
I almost didn't carry on reading it.
E.
The letter itself was quite short.
F.
What I remember most is being so excited as it was my first job offer.
Unit 4, Pronunciation. Exercise 4. A.
How often do you check your email inbox? Do you think this is too often?
B.
Are there any minority languages in your country? Are they in danger of extinction?
C.
How effective are your oral communication skills? What can you do to improve them?
D.
Does mobile technology make it easier or more difficult to switch off from study or work?
E.
Is your own language difficult for other language speakers to learn?
F.
How are languages best learned? Are they easier to learn when you are young?
Unit 4. Exam Listening. Section 4. You will hear part of a lecture about text messaging. Listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 37. Good morning, everyone. I've been invited here today to talk a little about the research I've been doing into quite a modern form of communication, text messaging. I'm sure most of you here today will have already sent and received at least one text message today. It has become the most popular form of communication between friends and family, despite strong competition from social networking and email. We now send around 8 trillion text messages every year, which is amazing when you think that the first text message was only sent in 1992. Over half of British people now use a smartphone, and of those, over 92% choose texting as their preferred method of communication. And well over half of British people text every day, compared to only 47% who make a daily phone call. That's about 50 texts a week for the average person, which might sound a lot, but is comparatively few compared to other parts of the world. Unsurprisingly, it is young people who send the most texts. Amongst 18 to 25-year-olds, the average is 133 messages a week, which is more than double any other age group. And whilst 15% of the over 65s say they communicate by text on a daily basis, for the youngest age group, this figure rises to 9 out of 10. And it is this age group who prefer to message friends compared to the older generation whose main text recipients are family members. Apparently, men text more than women do and have a larger number of contacts that they regularly text, but they tend to be more functional in their texting and keep their texts short. Compare this to women who send fewer texts but are more likely to send long ones in which they cultivate friendships and relationships. More than half of women questioned are happy to discuss relationship issues and even express their love through a text message. For many of you, a time without text messaging might seem a dim and distant memory. In fact, it was back in December 1992 that the first ever text message was sent via the Vodafone telephone network from a PC to a telephone. The message was a simple greeting, "Merry Christmas." The original idea was to use texting as a quick and easy way to communicate within a company, a bit like paging. In fact, it wasn't until 1994 that the first commercial text messaging service was introduced by a mobile network. And even then, consumer interest was very low. It was not until 1993 that the first text messaging service was launched in Sweden. A year later, Vodafone introduced texting to the UK. At first, texters were only able to text someone within the same network, and it wasn't until 1999 that there was full compatibility between mobile networks. At first, texting was quite a long and laborious task, as predictive texting was not introduced until 1995. Another characteristic of early texting was that each message had to be short, at 160 characters or fewer. This limitation on length is what spawned the common shorthand used by texters the world over. Abbreviations like BTW for by the way and TTYL for talk to you later have now entered the English language for good, whether we like them or not. Fears that this text speak would have an adverse effect on children's language skills have so far proven incorrect. In fact, A recent study has shown that children who are fluent in text messaging have higher than average literacy skills compared to those who don't text.